Thank you everybody for joining. Appreciate you guys having me for the session. I'm sure it will be fun. And as the title says, we're going to be looking at working with APIs and OAuth 2 specifically in Azure Data Factory. Now, the picture you guys see in front of you is ironically how I feel when I deal with APIs for the most part. And I try to do my best, but I'm sure as it goes with a lot of other people too, it's like spilling your coffee and doesn't always turn out the way you want it to. So I'm hoping that you guys enjoy the session. Hopefully you'll learn something. I'd be happy to try and answer, any of your questions, and Mikhail and then Mark will, take care of that and look at that as we go. My name is Martin. I have my own company. That's why I get to choose fancy titles for myself, like the Chief Data Wrangler. I like to help people make sense of their data, and you can see the details of my blog, my company, my Twitter account, and also, probably most importantly, my repo in GitHub, where I will be posting the presentation slide deck after the session. We'll have this up at the end if you guys need to see it too, so no need to look at it too long. In terms of the agenda today, what we are going to be looking at is just a few different highlights and points. And surprisingly, you'll see that we're going to talk about a bunch of things other than Azure Data Factory to start off with. And it's unfortunate that we have to, but in the case of APIs, you sort of have to do a bunch of things before you actually get to the Azure Data Factory part. And so we're going to walk through all of those different steps, if you would, and areas that you need to address, spend time on, and get right before you can actually start your development in Azure Data Factory. And so once you do all of these things, it gets really easy, and the Azure Data Factory part's actually quite simple. Of course, I say that relatively speaking because APIs are not always the easiest to deal with. But today we're going to talk about just OAuth quickly. I'll give you guys a quick, just a quick few sentences on what that is and what that means. Then we're going to look at arguably the most important part of it, which is the authorization flow. We're going to look at a way to test APIs, and specifically, I'm going to use Postman for that. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we get there. And after all of that is said and done, and we get our API to actually work the way we need to, then we'll look at Azure Data Factory, how to build your pipeline, set up your linked services, and the datasets and all the rest of the stuff that you need to build. So let's have a look first at open authorization and what that is. And to put it simply, OAuth is really just a way for internet users like you and me to grant other websites or applications access to their information without giving them their passwords. And so the specific use case that we're going to look at today is something like Mint. And if you're not familiar with Mint, Mint is an application that you can use to sort of as a central management place for all of your finances. So you can connect it to all your bank accounts, import all of those transactions into Mint, and then you can create budgets and just keep track of everything. And so really in the world that we live in, where everything's in the cloud and everything is software as a service, it's important that you need to enable applications such as Mint to get your information from elsewhere. And in order for you to do that, you need to have the framework to do that. And that was really how open authorization started. And have its being is really just a means for you to be able to give that information or that access really without giving away your passwords and having your passwords for all of these systems stored all over the place. Now, OAuth 2, which is what we're really going to be looking at today, is really just an iteration of the same framework that's obviously gotten better over time. And so you don't have to be too concerned about that fact, but just know that open authorization is really the crux of what we'll be dealing with today. Now, the most important part, as I mentioned before, of dealing with OAuth specifically is what we call the authorization flow. And that is sort of the first handshake that you will have between yourself, the application that you're granting access to, and also the intermediary or the application that you're getting the information from. So there's these three parties that play a role, and the whole OAuth framework really dictates what needs to happen in terms of this handshake before you are granting access successfully to whatever application you're dealing with. And so we're going to deal with the authorization flow. It's the most important part. And if you don't get this part to work, then nothing else will really work. So let's go back to our example and imagine this little guy on the left-hand side is me or you for that matter. And we want to use Mint in order to manage all of our finances. We want to use it to import our transactions from different banks and credit cards and then build some budgets or create some budgets to manage that. And so what I would typically do is you would go to Mint, create your profile there, and then you'd say, hey, Mint, I would like to see all of my transactions from a specific bank. And then Mint on the other side will say, okay, sure, I can help you with that. And then we'll start with the process of doing that for you. So it'll go to the bank in question and it will say, hey, I've got this user, Mr. X, and he would like to see all of his transactions in our app. The bank then says, okay, I can do that, but I don't really trust you. So here's a login screen because we need to make sure that Mr. X is really who he says he is. And we need to make sure that he really wants to give you access to all of his information. And so after that, the bank then surfaces this login screen, which then shows to the end user, you or me at the end of the day. You will put in your credentials, Mr. X, and your password. You will sign in. And now, after you've done that, the bank will know that you are who you say you are and that you really want to give Mint access to all of that information. And so the bank will respond back and say, hey, thank you, Mr. X is who he says he is. He could successfully log in. Here's an authorization code. Okay, so that's the first piece of information that your bank's API will send to Mint. It doesn't send it directly to you. It really just sends it to Mint as Mint is facilitating, this entire handshake. So the authorization code is sent to Mint. And then Mint will use that authorization code to get an access token and a refresh token. Okay, so the handshake is then complete at that point in time. So the bank first makes you log in. After you log in, it sends back an authorization code to Mint. Mint then uses that authorization code to exchange it for two things, an access token and a refresh token. And those are the two pieces of information or pieces of data that is then required to extract any of the information or communicate with the actual API. And that, in short, is really the authorization flow, or if you want to get more specific, it's called the code flow. So these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Sometimes they get a little more complicated, but in the most basic of terms, this is what really needs to happen. So ultimately, what we need to do is we need to perform the same kind of handshake and extract the same information. So get an authorization code, exchange it for an access token and a refresh token if we want to deal with an OAuth 2 API. And so you might be looking at me like this after seeing all of it and saying, okay, I don't see the problem. It looks pretty basic and straightforward. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is that there are a lot of nuances and challenges when it comes to OAuth 2 APIs. And so let's look at, or at least talk about some of these challenges. So the first thing that is really challenging is just the variation. I've shown you the most basic version of that, but in reality, it's never that straightforward, right? So the OAuth framework is really just a framework. The basic handshake that I've shown you guys, or the authorization flow, is what is required by the framework. But then there's all these other things that the APIs can implement by themselves to either personalize it or make it more secure from their perspective. So what they would typically do is they would say, okay, but instead of just using the access code and the refresh token, we need you to give us this other piece of information. And sometimes it needs to be in the body, sometimes it needs to be in the header, sometimes it needs to be encoded, sometimes it shouldn't be encoded. And you have all of these variations that go on between the different APIs that, even though there's an OAuth standard, the standard is really just the beginning of it, and it's not necessarily the end result. And so the variation makes it super difficult. The other thing that's a challenge when dealing with the OAuth 2 APIs is that there's user interaction required for that first step. When we walk through the authorization flow, the first thing that'll happen is you'll get that login screen. So, okay, so if I need to get a login screen, how do I create an automation or a process that doesn't require this user interaction? And so that's a challenge that we're going to have to deal with, and something that that I'll show you guys, and something we'll walk through. And also, this is also the part that most of us get wrong in the beginning, because we want to do all of this in something like SSIS or Azure Data Factory, and those ETL tools are just not built to facilitate user interaction. And so there's a way we need to get around it, and we'll talk about that further today, and I'll show you guys how that works. The third thing that I find really challenging with APIs in general is just the error messages. They are known to be really bad and really short and not very descriptive, and it's because everything is sent over the wire. They don't have a ton of space to be very descriptive, or they just don't want to be. And most of the time you'll just get something like unauthorized, and you'll have to try and figure out why that actually happened. So that makes it super difficult. And again, if you start off in something like an ETL tool, the chances are that those error messages will not even be surfaced, or maybe even be cut off even shorter, and it's just even more difficult to try and figure out, where you're going wrong. And of course, now the last thing that we want to do here is we want to add an ETL tool like Azure Data Factory to the mix, And that makes things even more complicated. You have all of these different steps. You have to build this pipeline. If one of the steps fail, it's difficult to see really what goes on underneath the covers. And so after all that is being said, the next question is, where do we go from here? What direction should we take? What do we do? How do we get this stuff to work? And that is the goal of the session today. And I hope that you guys find the answers that you're looking for. And we're going to walk through the process, at least my process that I followed in getting an OAuth 2 API to work and to work successfully in Azure Data Factory. And we're going to just walk through all the different steps, and I'm going to show you guys how I approached it and how I got to solve it in the end of the day. And as I said in the beginning, ironically, we are not going to start with Azure Data Factory. It's really just the last step in the process. And so what I'm going to show you guys first is something called Postman. And so Postman is an application that you can download for free from the internet, and it allows you to interact and really store and test and save and do all of these things around APIs. You can even use it to develop your own. But in this case, we're really just going to use it as a mechanism to test our APIs and make sure that we can work through all the kinks, resolve all the errors, and then we know how the process works, and mostly due to the variation. So let me switch over here to my screen, and I'm going to show you guys what that looks like. So this is Postman, and please shout in the chat window if you guys cannot see it, but you should be able to see all of that right now. I'm going to walk you guys through Postman itself and just in general how we would set things up. And what I did here is I've set it up to connect to something called Zero. And actually, before we do that, let me show you guys what Zero looks like and what Zero actually is, because that's sort of important. Now, Zero is a financial program, similar to QuickBooks and others out there. And I actually use that for my own company to do all the financial stuff. And so what I've done here is I've created really a profile here in Zero, and I've connected it to a demo company, which is available free of charge in Zero that you can use yourself too. So I would definitely recommend it if you want to play around with an API to test things out. So you can do this today, create a profile in Zero. You'll see there's some transactions in there. It's all test and dummy stuff. And you'd be able to set everything up in order for you to play around with the actual APIs. Now, the first thing that you would need to do in Zero, and you typically would do that by going to developer.zero.com after you've associated that demo company with your profile, you would have to create an app. And an app establishes the baseline and certain very important information that you would need in order to communicate with the API. And so I wanted to walk you guys through that first, because that's sort of the foundation of everything that we need to deal with here. So firstly, we had to give it a name. I just chose 28t-demo for that. You need a company or application URL. Doesn't really matter what this is, at least for the purposes of what we're going to do. It's really just an identifier, and it needs to be a valid URL. You'll see that we have a referral ID at the bottom here, but that's not really used in anything that we're going to do again. So it's informational at this point. Where the real information lies is in the configuration section here. Very important thing that is required when you deal with OAuth 2 authorizations are the redirect URI. Now, it's not, and I know I thought this in the beginning when I started out with APIs, it's not a case of you needing to provide a URI where the actual application is going to navigate to. It's more just a piece of information that's going to be returned back to you so that you can identify that it's coming from the right place. And so again, it can be anything as long as it's a valid URI that you can identify and associate with. It doesn't have to be a specific site or a specific URI. Now, I'm going to say that with some caveats here. In most of the OAuth 2 APIs that I've dealt with, the redirect URI is really just informational, and you just need to know what it is. There are some APIs out there that are a little bit more sticky than that, and the redirect URI should be something really specific. Hopefully, all of those cases, that would be in the documentation and you would know about it. But for our purposes here, all we need, sorry about that, all we need to know is that we need some kind of URI that we can navigate to or identify. The two important pieces are really the following. So we have a client ID that's usually generated by the app itself, so we don't have control over that. And then we have a client secret. And you can have multiple different secrets that would identify you in the process. Now, those are the two really important pieces of information that we are going to need when we are trying to connect to the API and extract information from it. And as we walk through the Postman stuff, you will see where that becomes relevant. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's jump back into Postman. And so this is the Postman interface that you will typically see. And it looks pretty daunting in the beginning. There's a lot of stuff going on there. You'll probably end up like I do and not use half of it, but you really just need to know a few basics in order to get yourself going. And so the first thing you will do in Postman itself is you will create what's called a collection. And you can think of a collection as sort of the container that takes care of the authorization part, and we can store some variables, some environment variables and things like that, and then just reuse in all of the different API calls underneath that. So you first create the collection, you specify the authorization, we'll walk through that in a second, and then you can create all of these different calls to the different APIs or the requests. And each of those have their own settings and things that you can do with it. But let's focus on the collection itself first. And the important part here, as is with the handshake or the authorization flow that we've walked through, is really just going to be this authorization part of it. Now, Postman makes it easy for us in terms of showing us where we've changed things by giving us the little colored dot next to it. So you can see at this point, I've done something in authorization, I've done something in variables. I have the option to create some pre-request scripts and tests and all those kinds of things, but I'm not going to do that today. In the authorization screen of this collection, you have to pick what kind of authorization you are going to use. Now, all of these are different and all of these have different requirements. Obviously, we are talking about OAuth 2 here, and so that's what we're going to pick. You can see here that I'm requesting it to be sent in the headers and not the request URL. So again, that's specific to your API. For the most part, it will always be in the headers that you will send the authorization info, and so that's typically selected by default. Current token, we don't have a token right now. I'm going to show you guys how that works, so let's ignore that for a second. And here's all the details that's important for what we are trying to do with this specific application and API. So there's a bunch of things that we need to set here. We can give the token a name. I don't really care about doing that, and it's not necessary. But then you have to pick a bunch of other things. So in the most basic format, the authorization flow, the grant type would usually be authorization code. And all that means is it means that you are going to send and request an authorization code. There are other things that you can do too, like sending password credentials or sending client credentials, or there's even an extension to what we're doing here, which is called authorization code with PKCE or PIXE for short. And that's sort of just an add-on to the authorization flow that I've shown you guys, in the sense that you create this random code and then you send that to, and then there's the whole challenge part of it. So it complicates the process a little bit. Luckily, our app allows us to only do OAuth 2, and we don't have to, it doesn't force us to do the PIXE part of it. But just know that if you are forced to do that, then there's probably a few additional steps that you need to take. The next thing we need is we need a callback URL. And this is where it gets interesting. So you guys can see here that I have these two little brackets, squiggly brackets, and then something in the middle there. And that's the way we refer to a variable in Postman. And so I'm going to jump straight across to the variable section. And you'll see that I've set up a bunch of variables here. And this is a great thing to do in Postman. It really helps you down the line. You set up all of the variables for things that you are going to reuse. And you can do it once and sort of forget about it. And then you can just use it in whichever other step you need to do. So you can see I've created one for client ID, the client secret, the refresh token. There's the redirect URI, and that matches what I have in the app. And then I'm also setting some scopes. So that's just the scopes are really just the access that I'm going to give to this application. And that's usually dictated by by whatever app you're dealing with, and the documentation will usually tell you what options you have. And then I'm just, I've created something for page size so that I can just reuse it and set it once, as opposed to redefining it in every single API request. And so going back to the authorization screen, so you can see that I'm just pointing to the variable for that. I have an auth URL that's just from the documentation, and that's going to be used when I am doing the authorization flow. There's an access token URL that'll be used in that second part of the handshake. And then I refer to some more variables for the client ID, the client secret, that's from my app, and then also I have my scopes. The state here is something that you can define, and that's sort of unique, and I'll hover over the little information bubble here so you can see what that says. It's really just any value that you choose that helps prevent cross-site request forgeries. So essentially what's going to happen is you set this here, and then every single request needs to include the state so you can validate that it's actually coming from the right application and not something else. The last part here, client authentication, I want to send the client credentials in the body. Again, you have a few options here, but typically you would send all of that in the body. Okay, so that's a bunch of information, but all of this is really required in order for us to do the authentication. And so with all of this information, the next thing that we want to do is we want to click on this button that says get new access token. And what I'll do is I'll just drag this window across so you guys can see it, but it's now started that authorization flow. So it's gone to Zero, the Zero API, and it said, hey, here's somebody that wants to give access to their information. And then Zero has responded with a login screen to say, okay, identify yourself and tell us who you are. And so what I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to log in so that it knows who I am. And we'll do that. We'll give that a second. And then usually this is the next screen that pops up, and it's going to confirm the scopes that we have identified in that authorization flow. And so here it says this is going to be the organization data. It wants the user access or access to some of the user info. And as the end user, you have to consent to doing that. And so by clicking this button, I am now, as the end user, consenting that this app, Postman in this case, can get access to my information. And if all of that is successful, this is the very next window you typically will see. And this is now the actual token that's been returned. So that's actually the complete handshake that's now been done here. We've taken the request and we've exchanged it for the access token and the refresh token. Okay. And so that completes all of that. And so this window shows you the access token first. I'll scroll down a little bit so you can see it. It's a pretty long string there. It tells us what the type of token is. It's usually bearer for OAuth type 2. And that's important because that's sort of the prefix it'll use when it sends this across the wire. This ID token is just something internal that we don't necessarily need. We have an expiration date, so that's 1800 seconds, 30 minutes. And then we have the most important part, which is the refresh token, because we'll need that to refresh it after everything expires. And then it confirmed the scope. Okay, so a bunch of important information here. And there's a couple of things that I want to do here. First is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to copy the refresh token, so I have it. I'm going to save it in a variable, and you'll see why later. And the rest of it is already here, and I can tell Postman to now use this token. And once I click on it, you will see that it populates this little text box with our actual access token. Now I can also go back in here. I can say manage tokens. I can click on the token here, and I can get the actual token details again if I need to. So this is all the information I now need to start communicating with the API itself. All right, and before I forget, let me go here, and I want to save that refresh token. And remember, when you do that, you always want to click save here at the top, otherwise it won't be persisted. And I think we are now ready to start testing our API. Okay, and let's do that. So one of the API requests that we have in Zero, and again, this is going to be different depending on the actual API that you're dealing with, but the one that we have in Zero is called the Connections API. And you usually call that first because it returns what companies you have access to, and then also the tenant ID of that company that you need for all of the other API calls, right? So this is sort of a good way for us to test and see if everything worked. And once I click send, it'll send the request to the API. I can see that I got a response back, and the response contains the name of the company. You see demo company US, the tenant type is an organization, and then the tenant ID, which will be then important for, for all of our other API calls. Now, if I go back to the actual collection, you'll see in the variables, I've already done that. Sorry, it's not that. It is the tenant ID. I've already saved it in there, so there's nothing for us to do. But in a lot of cases, you would have to do something like this. And this is where the variation comes in. You have to call an API or send an API request first to get some piece of information that then needs to be included in all of the other API requests. Now, luckily, this doesn't change all the time. So I can do this once and sort of have that. But it also means that, in order for you to get that information, it's really a good idea not to start in Azure Data Factory and rather start in something like Postman that gives you the ability to do that. A couple of nice things I want to point out here is all of the different things here that you have access to in Postman that really gives you a bunch of information and good information about the response and about what you were sending. And this is really going to help you down the line if you have any issues with the API request or if you get any unexpected errors. So this is definitely something you want to keep in mind. So if we look at authorization, we can see it's inheriting it from the parent collection. So not much to do there. We can look at the headers, and you can see the grayed out ones. If I zoom in here, The grayed out ones are automatically generated by Postman, but then there's a bunch of others that you can actually set, and you can add some if you need to. And that's important to know because it's not always obvious why some things are not working. But with all of this information, you can see exactly what was sent in the headers. Those are all checked. You can uncheck it if you want to exclude it from the request, just when you send it again. So you have a lot of choices here in terms of what you do. So this is the request part. You see the body. There was nothing in the body, and it didn't have a specific type. And there's a bunch of other things that you can look at. You can also look at the response in a lot of detail. So we have the body here. You can look at cookies, you can look at headers, and there's even test results if you were building tests that you would have access to. So a bunch of really good information that something like an ETL tool just wouldn't give you right off the bat. But good info to have, good things to see here. And luckily, I am able to run this successfully, and it's working pretty well, and no issues so far. Okay. All of that being said, let's look at a real application of an API request, and something we would typically want to then do automatically in something like Azure Data Factory down the line. And an example of that would be this guy over here, which is just an API to extract all your invoices and the information around them. And so what I did here is you add the URL here. You have a type. Most of the time it's get, unless you are trying to refresh tokens or update or change information. If you're just extracting, it'll be get all the time. And you'll see that I've added some parameters in here. So this API allows me to send a bunch of different parameters. One is an indicator to say I only want to see the summary, and you can set that to true or false. There are some filters, and you can see that I've done that. There's a modified after filter that you can use, but then there's also more complicated filters where you can define sort of a where clause really, and filter on specific types and dates. And now you can see that none of these have been checked, which means that if I send this request right now, and we can do that, it's going to return all of my invoices for all time. And you can see the size here is quite big for an API response, and that's because it returned every single thing with a whole bunch of detail. If I show you guys, and we can just page through that pretty quick. But that's a bunch of stuff, and you probably don't want to send it all the time. If I want to add one of these parameters, I can just check it, and you will see that it's now added it to the URL string at the top as a parameter. I can click send again, and the data will be different. You can see the size has decreased by quite a bit, just because I'm only returning summary information at this point. So I'm doing all of this just to show you guys how, once you get it all to work, how powerful this tool is and how easy it is to really test your APIs. And what's even nicer is you can just save all of this stuff for reference, and then come back to it when you come back to it. You can play around with a bunch of different parameters when you need to, and exclude them if you don't want to. So you have a ton of flexibility here in the sense of trying out different things and in real time seeing what the responses look like before you try and automate the process. And the same things apply here. You have access to the information parts of it. I'm sorry, the authorization part. You can see the headers. And again, you can see I've added this header for the 0 tenant ID, and I'm pointing that to my variable. If I don't include that for whatever reason, and this is again a nuance of APIs, all it's going to tell me is forbidden. Very difficult to try and troubleshoot if you don't read the docs, and have a tool like this to at least make it a little easy. So I'll just do that again, and you'll see once I add that back into the headers, it will work just fine. And all the rest of the stuff is still there that we can do. And so now that we have all of this, it's a really good platform. We've now gotten the authorization stuff to work. We've gone through the initial exchange or the authorization flow. That works. We are able to call some of the APIs or send requests to some of the APIs. And so the last thing we really need to test is, okay, how do I refresh these tokens once it expires? Okay, because it is going to expire after 30 minutes, and I need to be able to refresh it in order to continue doing the work. I don't want to go through the manual login process every single time. And the only way to do that is to refresh the tokens. And that's also why you got a refresh token, is so that you don't have to go through that login process or the manual login process every single time. And so for Zero, the API to use for that is this. It's identity.zero.com/connect/token. And very importantly, it's a post API or a post request that you're sending. It's not a get. And that's something that's really important to take note of. Again, that's typically in your API documentation. Now, I'm not going to go to the API documentation specifically for Zero, but if you read all of their documentation, you'll notice that they say, okay, when you try and refresh the tokens, there's got to be some information that you need to send it. And so their requirement is that you send it as a basic authorization header And for the username, you'll use the client ID. And then for the password, you'll use the client secret, which is what I'm doing here. And you'll see, once I do all of that, you'll see that that appears in the header because authorization stuff automatically goes there. And so Postman will add this to the header. You can see the top line there where it says authorization. You can also see basic, and then you see a bunch of jumbled information that doesn't look like our client ID at all. And I know this because, you know, we can go back and check it, but this sort of points out a really important piece of information that will probably trip you up and that you probably will have to go back with. And that little bit of information is really the fact that all of this is base 64 encoded. So by default, what Postman will do is every single thing in authorization, it'll encode with base 64. And if you don't do it, it doesn't work. And the only way for you to really see it is to come in here and go and look at the actual, you know, authorization header that it generated and see that the codes don't match up. And with that information, you are then able to go and, you know, troubleshoot and see why things aren't necessarily working. But that's important information. We're going to use it later. Just take note of that. The other important piece of information that we need, again, that's from the API documentation, is we need to send two additional things. So in addition to the authorization header, we need to send the refresh token that we received in the first place, and we need to tell it what grant type. So what do we need back from this API? And what we need back is pretty simple. It's just refresh token, and that's the actual token that we're referring to here. You'll recall that I saved that in my variables before. Okay, so this, once we execute it, or once we send the request, we'll send that information to the API and say, hey, I need a new refresh token because, you know, the access token that I have at this point in time is no longer valid. And so let's do that. And once you do that, you can see what it's now returned is a new access token. And pretty much the same information we saw in the other access token. So it's given us the ID, it's given us the expiry, and it's given us a new refresh token. And so what you do from here is you take the access token, you now save it as the access token, and let's actually go through that. So I can take this part, and I'll just copy that, go back to my collection there, and I can just replace it, and you can see it's right there, and test it to make sure we're all still good. Actually, I have to save it. Maybe not. And we'll just send the information again, and you see it all still works beautifully fine. The other thing that I would need as well is the refresh token. And I would need that because I'll need this refresh token when this access token has expired, you know, so you need those two pieces of information to continue doing this and continue sending requests. So this whole mechanism that we're going through here is the mechanism that our ETL tool needs to be able to perform in order to continuously recycle these access tokens and get new ones and new refresh tokens to go through the authorization process again without needing user interaction. And so this is all great information. We've now successfully been able to do all of this stuff in Postman. And with this information, we can now finally go to Azure Data Factory, and we can start sending things up. So let me pause there for a second. I need a drink of water. Let me check in with Mark or Mikhail. Are there any questions that you guys think we can address and answer right now?
Let's just do one quick question. So just to be clear, when you were creating the app in Zero, are you just creating the REST API endpoint? And if so, I presume some services will already have these published. Is that correct?
Yes, except for the fact that you're not really creating the endpoint. All you're really doing is you're essentially putting the plumbing in place that allows the API to communicate with your profile and your tenant. And you're creating the authorization mechanism by means of that client ID that you saw and the secret. Those are the details that you need in order to facilitate the interaction with the API. So the API is there, it works, it's doing what it's doing, but you need to sort of create the plumbing for any outside application to communicate with your tenant in Zero in this case.
Okay, cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Hope so. If it makes sense to you, Mark, then we'll go with it. All right, cool. Thank you for that question. So let's continue with the rest of it. Okay, so with all of that info, let's go to Azure Data Factory or Azure at least, and we're going to start setting up the plumbing or all the different pieces that we need to set up in order to make this work. Now, I'm not in Azure Data Factory right now, as you can see. I'm actually in Azure Key Vault, and I wanted to start here because it's important that you set this up first before you even start. And we do this because there's some important sensitive information that we need to store. And the best place to do that is really, in Azure Key Vault. So you create the Key Vault, you'll see the name of it right there. It doesn't really matter what the name is. And then I've created a bunch of placeholders really for the different secrets that I'm going to store. Now you can see there's one for the access token, one for the client ID, the secret, the refresh token, and then also this tenant ID that I'm going to need for every single API request. And so these are just placeholders that will then keep on replacing the secrets and refreshing it with the latest information, as we work with it in Azure Data Factory. Now, the placeholders are one thing. The other thing that's really important is the security you set up around it. And in order for your Azure Data Factory to communicate successfully with Azure Key Vault, you need to give it Key Vault Secrets Officer permissions. Now, that's very important because if you only give it reader permissions, it's not going to work because you're trying to save things to the actual secrets. You'll also notice that if you add roles, if you look at the different roles that you have there, it's very confusing. I'm not sure why they did it like that, but you have reader permissions and you have Key Vault reader permissions, and those are different. And what you really need for the Key Vault is the Key Vault reader permissions and not just the reader in general. And it's one of those nuances that make it super confusing. But in order for all of this to work, what you need to do is add the managed identity of your data factory in here as a Key Vault officer, and that's going to allow it to do whatever it needs to do, extract the secrets, and then also save new values to the existing secrets. And you see that I've done that over there. Okay, so that's one piece. The next piece that we'll have to get in place is the linked service in Azure Data Factory. So I've created one here. What you'll see is that I've just created a generic REST connection, if you would, or linked service. That is very, very important, and I'll tell you guys why, and we'll also reiterate that right at the end. But there's typically a couple of different ways that you can do things. For some APIs, there will be built-in linked services. So Xero is actually one of them. And so if you go into Azure Data Factory and you create a new one, it'll give you the option to create a linked service for Xero specifically. I don't like to use that because you have to specify all the connection information and the authentication info in that linked service. And if you get something wrong, it's going to fail without any good explanation why. So what I like to do is I like to use the generic REST linked service, and you specify the base URL, as you can see there, which is the base URL of my API in Xero. And then the authentication type is anonymous because we are not going to authenticate here, but rather in the pipeline itself. And so by doing it this way, we have full control over what we're sending over the wire and to the API and how we communicate with it, as opposed to relying on the built-in plumbing, if you would, or the built-in ways that Azure Data Factory has for the application-specific linked service. Again, I don't like to use that because I think that there's a lot of things that they do underneath the covers. You wouldn't necessarily know if they're encoding things or if they're not encoding things, and it makes it super difficult to troubleshoot if you don't. So my recommendation would be create a REST service, a generic one, and then you take care of the authentication yourself. Okay, so that's a linked service, pretty straightforward. Now, when we go over to Azure Data Factory, the rest is actually not that difficult to set up. The first thing you need is a data set, and that's sort of the placeholder for the data that you're going to be extracted. And you can see that we've created a parameter here for the relative URL, and that's just going to allow us to reuse the same data set and just change the relative URL for all the different APIs we want to call. In the connections, pretty straightforward again. The base URL is already set. The relative URL, it will accept the parameters value, and then it's pointing to the linked service that we've just created. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff right there. The next thing we need to create is a pipeline that we can use to refresh the tokens. And so the pipeline will look like the following. On the left-hand side, you have 3 tasks that actually go to Azure Key Vault and extracts all of the different secrets that we have stored there. The web task in the middle actually then sends the request to refresh the token, similar to what we did in Postman, to Xero. So that's the refresh token API. And then the output from that will then use in the last 2 steps on the right-hand side to save the refresh token and the access token back into Azure Key Vault. So let's look at the details there. Again, I've got a parameter here just for the Key Vault secret URL. You can't make it all out there, but it's typically the name of your Key Vault, .vault, and I'll highlight it, .azure.net/secrets. So that allows us to get to the secrets directly. And then each of these web tasks will do something similar. I'll go to the settings first and show you what these are doing. So the URL is, it's really just getting the URL from the parameter, and then you can see it's just adding the name of the actual secret. So that's Xero-client-id. So that's the name of my secret in Azure Key Vault. And then the others just, syntactic stuff that you need. So you need the API version, which in this case we're using version 7. So with that being said, we can call the get method. You can see right there, and that's pretty much all we need. And that is going to return the value of that secret. Now, one other thing I want to point out here is you'll see that I have opted to secure the output and the input. Now, while you're testing it, you probably don't want to do that because you'd want to see what's being returned. But when you do move into production, I would definitely recommend that you check both of those boxes. If you don't do that, all of the stuff that you're sending, including the access token, will be stored in plain text in your logs. And that creates quite a big security risk because people can look at the logs and see what the access tokens and the client IDs and everything is. So you don't want to do that. So definitely remember to check those two options. Then moving on to the next step, that's where we actually then call or send the request to the Zero API. And similar things here. I'll show you guys what that looks like. So you'll recognize this URL. It's pretty much the same one as we've had in Postman. And that's to get the new token. And then here are the important bits that you probably didn't see right off the bat, and that's super important. So it's the authorization and the content type headers that you need to add here. And I'll show you what this looks like. So what we're doing here is we're getting the client ID, and then we're essentially just really converting it with base 64. And you'll see that that's what that does. And we add basic in front of it because remember in Postman it needed to be sent in a basic authentication header. So that's all we're doing there. And usually between the username and the password, if you would, or in this case the client ID and the secret, there's typically a colon that's typically standard for basic authorization headers. Again, something that's very difficult to know unless you have something like Postman to really look at what it generated for you. And you will see it in there as being the sort of splitter between the username and the password. So I'm just concatenating those two things, or three things if you would, and then I'm converting it with base 64, and that gets added to the authorization header. And because I have encoded that with base 64, it's important that you specify that in the content type. That is something that's not always that easy to see or observe, but just know that in something like Azure Data Factory, it's not going to know that it is encoded, and you have to specify, especially if it's in the header, that it is, and you do that by the content type. The body, we have the grant type, just the parameters that we had in Postman, and you can see that in there. And we're getting the necessary refresh token. We're sending that, and that's pretty much all that there is to it. So we're doing all of that. We're getting the output from that, and then we're saving that output, as you can see here. We're just taking that same output, and that we're just getting from the previous step. We're getting the output, and we're getting the refresh token that it sends back, and that's the part that will be saved again in Azure Key Vault. And you can see for authentication, we've used the managed identity, and the resource there is vault.azure.net. That all being said, now that we have a pipeline that we can actually use to refresh our tokens, the only other thing that we need to do is build an actual pipeline that now extracts the data that we want. So, send the actual API requests. And so this is what it would look like for something like the invoices. Again, I have a few parameters, just specifying the secrets URL, the API relative URL, some schema information. That's just because of where I want to send the information. And then similar to the previous pipeline I showed you, we get the necessary tenant ID and access token from Azure Key Vault, and we do it in a similar fashion as we've done before. And then the last step, we actually extract the data, and I'll show you guys what that looks like. We're sending a get method to that relative URL that we've specified, and the authorization details and zero tenant ID, similar to what we did with Postman. And all of that is going to do exactly what it did in Postman and extract the information. So that's a ton of information, but I wanted to walk you guys quickly through it. Let's talk about the last couple of things that I wanted to share with you guys. And that's some lessons that I learned the hard way that I hope that you guys don't have to learn yourself, as you work through this. So very first thing is the API docs will be super important. They will be different. I found them to be typically vague, but that's all you have, and you have to start there. So as much as I also hate, reading through all the documentation, that's going to be your best bet in terms of starting with all of this. Second thing I can recommend is to start with Postman, and with the asterisks, I'm trying to imply that you don't have to use Postman if you don't want to. There are other tools out there that are also free that you can also use for the same purpose. For whatever reason, I just started with Postman and really like the interface, and so that's what I prefer. Thirdly, use a generic linked service in Azure Data Factory. Don't use the built-in one specific to the application you're dealing with. I think you'll get a lot further by using the generic one and then doing authentication yourself. Also a lot easier to troubleshoot. Very worth saying again, use Azure Key Vault to store the sensitive information. And then as a fifth point, always separate out the token refresh. And that's why I showed you that pipeline first. There's usually two ways you can go about refreshing your tokens. Either would work, but I obviously have a preference. And so let's quickly talk about the two different things that you can do there. When you are running your automation in Azure Data Factory, you can either say, well, I'm going to wait for it to fail. And if it fails, I'm going to assume that it's because the token is no longer valid, it's expired. And at that point, I'm going to do the whole token refresh. Or alternatively, what you could do is you could say, I'm going to refresh the token every single time before I run whatever job is running or whatever automation. I prefer the second method, and I prefer it because there may be other reasons why your request fails, and you're going to complicate things quite a bit by trying to figure out what that is and not ending in some kind of an endless loop. And so I like to do it in the beginning. I do that once, and then I run all my jobs that need to run. That being said, if you know that your API requests are going to run for longer than 30 minutes, then maybe you want to rethink your strategy in terms of only doing it once in the beginning and maybe not running many jobs in parallel, and then maybe halfway through refreshing the tokens again. In my experience, there's no issue with refreshing tokens often. That's usually not an issue for most APIs out there. Last point I want to make is about pagination. You'll notice in Azure Data Factory that there are some pagination rules that you can add, and that's because most APIs have a restriction in terms of the amount of data they would return to you. It varies greatly by API, so it's not always the same. But I want to just put a word of caution out there in terms of using the pagination rules. Within the pagination itself of an API, there's also a ton of variation. And so again, if you're going to use the built-in feature of Azure Data Factory, you may run into a few snags in the sense that it may not work the way you want it to work. And as complicated as it's going to be, if you have large result sets that you need to return by APIs, I would definitely recommend that you rather roll your own and either try to filter the data as much as possible where it's not going to exceed those limits, or build in your own kind of pagination logic as opposed to using the built-in pagination rules feature inside of Azure Data Factory. Again, it may work, it may not, but it's so difficult to say with the variation that you get out there. That was a long-winded story, and I'm happy that you guys stuck with us through that. The last thing I want to point out would be a few resources. There's a reference for OAuth if you wanted to read that up, and then some other resources there. Right at the bottom is a link to a blog series I have on this topic. So if you want to go look at that for some further reason, you are more than welcome to. So thank you guys. That's been a lot of info. I hope you found it somewhat useful. I'm going to switch over to Mark and Mikhail and see if there's any questions we can answer at this point.
Yes, there is. Some of the questions you have already almost answered, but we will keep them in for clarification. First one goes like this: the published API. Is there a standard way of documenting what it can do, what it does, how you should call it? It would be very hard to experiment your way to a working authentication model every time.
Agreed. So to answer the question, no, there is no standard way. OAuth is the framework, and the framework is very vague. And so every vendor out there has decided to add their own nuances to it because either they feel it's more secure or they think it adds functionality to what they're doing. And so that's unfortunate for us at the consumer end of it. You have no other means than to really try and learn all the nuances of your API. And that's why I use Postman. For me, that's the easiest platform to try and work through all of those challenges.
Cool. No shortcut. Thanks.
Yep. I wish there was. Trust me, I would have found it by now.
Okay, so we noticed that you had a duration on the tokens, which looked like it was a static value. So can we actually set a custom value for the token expiry, or is it literally fixed?
Great question. It is always fixed and determined by your API vendor, so it's not always the same. Some API vendors may let you use the same tokens for an hour or 2 or 3, sometimes even for a day, and then others are really sticky and they'll only be valid for 10 minutes or so. It's always and again, it's one of those nuances. It's always specific to the vendor that you're dealing with.
I have a follow-up question to that personally. Could we have some kind of time that we have the actual consent being revoked automatically, so the token refresh actually stops refreshing the token in a set time? So I will give you permission to look at my zero data for 2 weeks, and then it's out. You have to require new permissions again.
Interesting. I think the best way to try and control that would be with the client secrets or with Azure Key Vault secrets themselves. You know, in Azure Key Vault, you can set the validity period for those secrets themselves. And so if that expires, then you just can no longer access them. So that could be an option to you. The other option would be, as you saw in Xero, where you set up the app. Now, Xero doesn't allow you to set an expiry date on those, but I'm sure some other vendors out there let you do that, or you just can go and delete that, you know, that client secret, and you would no longer be able to use it.
I'm wondering, Martin, if this could be a good reason not to use OAuth 2. So instead of that authentication method, to use a personal access token, because for those you can actually set a custom expiry time, can't you?
True. Yes. You know, and to be honest with you, the reason I landed on OAuth 2 was it's again very vendor specific. So not all vendors allow you to do all types of authorization. In the case of Xero, you can only do OAuth 2, or you can do OAuth 2 with Pixie, which is really just an extension. So in my experience so far, at least, most APIs would allow the OAuth 2 authorization flow, or the code flow, if we want to get really specific. Not all of them allow the personal access codes.
We have a follow-up question as well from Azure that says, if your ETL runs, say, every 24 hours and the refresh token, it expires after 30 minutes, will it be able to refresh the access token even though the access token actually expired 23.5 hours ago?
Yes, great question. Absolutely, yes. The refresh tokens themselves usually stay valid for, it's usually days. And again, it varies a little bit by vendor that you're dealing with, but most of the time it would be at least a few days, maybe even 30 days in some cases, where you can use the same refresh token to get another one.
So you're going to like this one. The old adage, it's not rocket science, seems not necessarily to hold up with using OAuth 2 and REST APIs through Azure Data Factory. Is there a good place where I can get started beyond the links you have given, or will I just have to bite the bullet?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure how to answer it without promoting my own work. I was actually telling the guys before the time that I landed on this topic because I was frustrated myself in trying to get it to work and didn't find any good references out there. So I know there's a few people in the community that have started blogging about it a little bit. I don't know of any others that have addressed OAuth 2 specifically, but I know Megan Longoria has a few blog posts around the topic. I know Koen Verbeek also has a blog or two about the topic. And I wanted to document that just out of my own frustration and need to document things for myself. So yeah, I'm sorry. I wish there was an easier way. There isn't, and I think it's because it's very different worlds that we're dealing with. The one is an application development world that we're not used to, and the other is a data consumption world that we're trying to sort of bridge the gap, and it's just not easy.
So with this infinite source of wisdom you've written, do you think we should always use OAuth 2 where it's supported, or should we go for other kinds of authentication that is perfectly acceptable and still a good practice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it depends. That would be the right consulting answer to give. You know, I'd say this: basic authentication is not really that secure. At least that's the general consensus out there, and also the reason why OAuth 2 was developed. All of the other types of authorization flows you will find is a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated than OAuth 2. So you know, that coupled with the fact that most API vendors at least have the OAuth 2 code flow as part of their authorization protocol, I think it's a good place to be. By that, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't try anything else. You know, whatever works, works. But I wouldn't be surprised if most vendors, you know, go at least the OAuth 2 route for authentication, at least.
So I believe that was the last of our questions in the list. A couple of guys thanked you for a super session, awesome session, and we can only agree. Thanks to everybody, and special big thanks to you, Martin, from the United States live.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening as long as you have. Hit me up on Twitter or anywhere else if you have any questions. And with that, I'll say goodbye from a very hot and steamy Phoenix.